What is the China model? Is China so special that it must have its own model for governing the country? How does the China model affect China's politics, government, economic society? How does the China model differ from Western models? What are its tensions or contradictions? Let's find out if the China model gets us closer to China.
In today's world, no one would question the extraordinary economic success China has achieved. As China continued its remarkable growth, especially after the financial crisis of 2008 and 9, a new governance model began to emerge. It features a strong state combined with a market economy, a one-party political system, constant trial and error experimentation, and an overarching commitment to development. The China model, as it is now called, has been developed by several scholars. In 2004, Joshua Cooper Ramo coined the term the Beijing Consensus, which promotes political innovation and constant experimentation in finding optimal systems for the current conditions, especially for developing countries, and which opposes the Washington Consensus of liberal democracy. Zhang Weiwei, the renowned political scholar in China, says that, quote, "It is inaccurate to describe the China model as the Beijing Consensus versus the Washington Consensus." In his own interpretation of the China model, he highlights the following elements: pragmatic concern over improving people's standards of living, constant trial and error experimentation, gradual reform rather than economic shock therapy, a strong pro-development state, the selective incorporation of foreign ideas, and a pattern of implementing easy reforms first and difficult ones later. But is there in fact a China model? How does it work? What are its salient features? And what, if anything, can other countries learn from it?
The model refers to a summary of typical features, good practices, experiences in China's process of modernization. You may call this the Chinese approach to development, to modernization.
So the China model as a whole, meaning democracy at the bottom, experimentation in the middle, and meritocracy at the top, is only, I think that is difficult to export as a model.
The diplomatic importance of China model, to me, refers to two things. First, in terms of foreign relations, the China model upholds an independent foreign policy of peace. Second, in terms of the international community, is the principle of peaceful coexistence.
China find the way, to solve the problem, which is very consistent with the Chinese, existing institutions, including the politics.
If one goes back in recent history, 4 decades ago, Cultural Revolution and some of the mass political movements of the 1950s and 60s, you didn't see this in operation. You saw, chaos and ruinous kinds of activity as a result of a singular one-party system.
Yeah, you're right. When I say the China model, you have to see this evolution of the China model. Indeed, after 1949, China went through ups and downs. We learned a lot from the bitter experience of the Cultural Revolution, where you have individual leaders who became overwhelmingly powerful, where you fail to have what we call the collective leadership. And then since 1978, China began to introduce a lot of new elements. So the China model began to take shape since 1978. By now, I can say this idea of so-called selection plus election or meritocracy-based model is more or less solid. Of course, we can go further, we can refine it, we can do even better. Yeah.
Many people from the West, when they look at China, they think, oh, there's been no political reform because the leaders are not selected by means of one person, one vote. But if you set aside what I think is a kind of dogmatic assumption, then it turns out that there's a lot of political reform because there are many different ways of selecting leaders over the past, at different levels of government, over the past 3 decades. And those ways of selecting leaders, I think, are substantially different than what was done 3 decades ago. So in particular, at the lowest levels of government, there's been a strong movement towards democratic elections as a way of selecting local level leaders. And at the highest levels of government, there's been more of an emphasis on meritocracy. That is, there's a decades-long process for the selection and promotion of leaders, including examinations. And they're supposed to have superior ability and virtue. And the more you go, the more you rise, the more you're supposed to manifest that superior ability and virtue through different tests and trials. And in between the lower levels of government and the higher levels, there's a lot of experimentation going on. And different cities have different ways of evaluating the performance of leaders. So basically what I refer to the political model is, to simplify, democracy at the bottom, experimentation in the middle, and meritocracy at the top. And it's both a kind of ideal that is used as a standard for evaluating political change, and it's also reality that has really taken place in China over the past 3 decades.
So in that sense, the Chinese model was to find a way to utilize the fundamental principles of incentives and reducing bureaucracy and still keep their overarching political system the way they think is best for the country. But it's not that that authoritarian system created the economy, but they found a way to utilize
the market system or something like
system and still keep their own system.
Definitely there is a two-way. You know, when the post-Washington consensus proposed that, you know, when you started economic reform and it makes the economy grow, you know, then you need actually to find a new political system to replace the existing one, you know. So they would have recommended a very radical political change, you know, ahead of the economic growth. Economic, you know, reform, right? But I think that created a lot of chaos actually initially, or lasting longer.
That was the Russian model.
That's the Russian model. You know, I think that China is very, you know, pragmatic in the way that you know because we inherited that kind of the political system. You know, we try to make that kind of things being an asset. You know, rather than the burden. You know, we utilize that to create some of the mechanism, you know, to fertilize the market systems to grow, actually to help, you know, the economy when needed, you know. So actually, you know, I probably think about this as, you know, for a supporting hand of the government, which actually try to address the issue of incentives, the bureaucracies, and pave the way for the economic growth. So I mean, existing institution initially that being kind of you know, for the assets rather than the burden of the you know of the authority you know at the time back in the early 1980s, you know. But it doesn't mean that the political system cannot change over time. You know, I think it's still on the way of the change. You know, if you're looking back to the 1980s and see what happened, you know, in the political system, and compare with what happened today. You know, I think there's so many changes have been taking place over the past 35 years. Mm-hmm. The inherited institutions should not be changing over time. And I think it's still, you know, change over time, but the change was kind of the inducive by the economic change. You know, so I think that for the government, you know, it's very smart. Is try to make the political change, you know, in the way that it is helping the economic growth, and they try to adapt themselves, you know, to the changing conditions as a result of the economic growth. So you can see that, you know, economic change would be the primary factor of the political change, and rather than the vice versa. Because, you know, if you make the political change first, you're probably going to lose the opportunities to be, you know, pushing the economic growth happening.
How does the China model relate to China's international relations?
从鸦片战争以后呢，
After the Opium War, China had been in an unequal position with the other countries in the international system for a long time. China was controlled by a lot of unequal treaties during that time. Those many unequal treaties left a great imprint on the mind of the Chinese. Over the more than 60 years after the founding of the new China in 1949, we have been emphasizing the country's independence in international relations. The principle is of pivotal importance in our foreign policy. So as I see it, this is how China's modern history plays a role. Second, with the China model, we practice the important principle of peaceful coexistence, an idea rich in meaning.
Culture Express. See the world in color.
Uncovering the truth.
We are on our way to Liadi, one of the most dangerous districts in the city of Karachi.
We were told that we're just about to cross the border between Malaysia and the Philippines.
Going the distance to get the story. We meet the real people with real hope.
For many young Thais, Muay Thai is one of the only ways to lift their families out of poverty.
Behind every corner is a great story. Assignment Asia. Expect the unexpected.
Is that a fair characterization of your approach to say your China model is dependent on Chinese exceptionalism?
No, actually, this term, exceptionalism, especially in English, is more or less, somehow related to this American exceptionalism.
Yes.
If we really move away from that kind of analogy, I would say in broad terms, in philosophical terms, each and every nation is unique, is in this sense, exceptional. There could be some rules which, are applicable to all, but there are also elements, important elements, which must be, different from each other nations. That makes the world more interesting. So the China model, in this sense, is really about certain unique features of the Chinese political, economic, social systems. For instance, we have the leadership of the Communist Party, which in the West, they do not take this as something normal for a country. But if you look at China's long history, this one-party system is more or less in consistency with China's long history. If you look at China from the Han Dynasty on, essentially, it's run by one party.
Sure.
I call the Confucian United or unified Confucian political entity. It's always like this, given the size of the country. So even by common sense assessment, sometimes describe the Chinese state as a state coming out of hundreds of states. It's the evolution of hundreds of states into one, amalgamated into one. So this kind of political structure fitting the Chinese reality. Yeah.
In your understanding of the China model and its applicability, does this depend on a so-called Chinese exceptionalism, that there's something special about China for cultural reasons or historical reasons that maintains a different need today in Chinese society than in other societies in developed countries?
Well, there's certain things that are quite distinctive to China. One obviously is the size of the country and the size of its population. And, so for example, democracy, I think, works well at local levels, and that's in many Western political thinkers, from Aristotle to Rousseau to Montesquieu, they made the same point, that at a local level, democracy works well because people are aware of the needs in their local communities. The issues are not so complex. It's easier to generate a spirit of community at the level of local community. And if you make a mistake, it's not a big deal. But at higher levels of government, then things become much more complex. And it's harder to generate a sense of community. And if you make a mistake, it is a big deal. So China, because of its size, it's kind of natural that there'd be different ways of selecting and promoting leaders at different levels of government. But in a smaller community, you know, like Iceland, you know, you wouldn't expect that sort of difference. So, okay, so I think the size matters. The political culture matters too. As mentioned, political meritocracy is really central to Chinese political culture in a way that it is not of many other cultures. And you can measure this today through lots of political surveys that show that there's this very strong attachment. Sometimes it's called guardianship discourse. Basically, there's a very strong notion that the leaders in China are expected to have superior ability and virtue in a way that may not be true, for example, in Canada, where I'm from. So just to give you an example, Canada is a smaller country in terms of population, has tons of natural resources, and it doesn't have a long history of political meritocracy. So the sorts of things that would be central to Canadian political discourse are not central in China, and vice versa.
China found a way in maintaining its own system and stability to find those kinds of mechanisms, incentives, reducing bureaucracy that economies need to develop. So does that mean that the so-called Chinese exceptionalism that some people talk about, that things are special here, is less important?
Well, I mean, if people are talking a lot more about authoritarian government, they say the government is getting strong. Well, I think so if you look at the world today, this is perhaps a lot of a strong government down there, but it's strong government that doesn't really guarantee whether the economy can grow. I think so, we probably got the strong governments in the past, but the economy didn't really, make any big progress. So I think, strong government doesn't really telling how the government, they actually, when you started the economic growth, we make the economies, growing in a way that is very open, it's very competitive, and actually, it is developing this market system.
If we look at China's model of independence and this new vision after reform in terms of focusing on development, shared interests as opposed to ideology, is there a lesson that can be learned from that can be applied by other countries, or is it a particular Chinese exceptionalism, whether it's developed countries in the West or whether it's developing countries in Africa or other places of the world?
我觉得任何大国啊，它都有两个
Actually, I believe every major power has two features. First, every major power has some exceptionalism. For China, we emphasize socialism with Chinese characteristics. For America, it is pretty much the same. America also emphasizes its uniqueness a lot. This is our common feature on the one hand. On the other, all major powers seek to develop friendly cooperation with more countries as they develop their international relations. So we can never simply generalize to say it is Chinese exceptionalism or particularism, but rather, China has certain exceptionalism or particularism as compared with others. At the same time, China has a strong desire to engage with an increasing number of countries to develop a community of common destiny, common responsibility, and common interests in peaceful coexistence. Also, if there are any lessons for other countries to learn about the diplomatic achievements of the China model, I'd say we still need to look at the issue from two aspects: lessons for developed countries and lessons for developing ones. Before elaborating on this issue, I want to emphasize one thing. That is, the Chinese are always talking about how they need to learn from foreign countries, learn from their advanced experiences and civilizations. In the meantime, they also highlight that in the international community, every country and every civilization has its own unique strengths. competitive edge, or positive qualities. So countries should all learn from each other and draw upon lessons from each other. From this point of view, I believe our China model, particularly its diplomatic significance, indeed has something to offer to the Western powers. Let me give you an example. In diplomacy, China seeks to develop partnerships instead of alliances. China accords great weight to the principle of mutual non-interference in each other's internal affairs. I think it actually offers some food for thought on the part of developed countries, especially major powers like America. They should think more about how to reduce their interference in other countries' internal affairs and reflect upon their preference and tendency to rely on armed forces rather than peaceful negotiation and consultation to solve problems. This is what China's practices can offer developed countries. Still, a significant feature of China's diplomacy lies in the fact we usually treat developing countries or developing regions as a whole. With a look at the history of Western diplomacy, we find many countries actually regard developing countries as divided individuals. There is an English saying that goes, divide and rule. But for the Chinese, we say unite and rule, taking developing countries as an integrated whole. In this sense, China's experiences can inspire Western countries to change their views and adopt a policy preferential to developing countries to get united or pursue common development. This is another thing China has to offer.
Do you see the China model being applicable in other countries, in the developing world, say in Africa, and even in the Western world? Are there elements that would improve the Western style of governance?
In fact, the China model is indeed, on the whole, part of Chinese culture, Chinese political traditions, Chinese philosophy, Chinese experience. Yet, certain elements from the Chinese model may be, useful or relevant for other countries, even for the Western countries.
For example?
For example, in political system, we talk about meritocracy. We talk about selection plus election. Maybe the West can borrow something there, indeed. How can you trust someone who can only talk well rather than do well? We trust, even for a company, if I got one person, one vote, and depending on how the guy talks, the company cannot run properly. In the 21st century, I think the state plays a very important role in international competition, in running the state. I think this idea of meritocracy is useful even for Western political system. Economically, the China model is a sharp contrast to Washington consensus, where the state in the China model plays a very important role, especially in terms of strategic planning. In the West, at least in most Western countries, you have really micro planning for each individual companies, schools, universities, but you don't have this strategic planning for the whole country. As the Chinese can do that, you know.
So you would say that the China model for the selection of top leaders, top political leaders, is relevant in China, but not necessarily relevant in Canada or other countries.
Well, I think it can be relevant for countries that are concerned with how to improve governance. So the China model as a whole, meaning democracy at the bottom, experimentation in the middle, and meritocracy at the top, is only, I think that is difficult to export as a model because so many of the features of the model are unique to China. But parts of it can be exported perhaps in modified form. So, for example, the idea of experimentation now, it's being carried out and actually borrowing from China in some African cities that are borrowing on, for example, these kind of special economic zones. The problem with that is that the features of the model do sometimes go together. In a democratic context where there's changes of government, there could be changes of policies quite quickly, and the experiments are not often long-lasting. So the new government could put an end to experiments. But in China, you can carry out these literally decades-long experiments, secure in the knowledge that at least at the change, there won't be these radical, at least at the top, there won't be these radical changes. That said, so you can carry out experimentation so long as people are aware that if there's a democratic country and change of leader at the top, it might not pan out a few years from now. Democracy at the bottom is very easy to export. In fact, that owes much more to the Western experience than to the Chinese experiments. Meritocracy at the top is perhaps the hardest to export because it really requires, for one thing, a long political culture. It requires a kind of strong commitment among the ordinary people to what we can call meritocracy. And it requires a lot of a decades-long efforts. It's not like, if you want to export like one person, one vote, it's not that hard, right? You want to try out elections in a new country, whoop, you just carry out elections. It's not that, I mean, it might fail because it doesn't fit the political culture, but to kind of implement one person, one vote is not so difficult. To implement meritocracy requires a long time and a kind of history and a kind of commitment to the people that may be lacking in many other countries. That said, some countries, have perhaps roughly similar conditions. Vietnam might be one. Some countries in Africa, like Rwanda and Ethiopia, are being influenced by this part of the Chinese model.
Many Chinese feel frustrated that much of the world, particularly the Western world, does not understand, much less appreciate, the China model. How to explain the China model? Chinese civilization, history, culture, philosophy are part of the answer. So are China's huge population, severe social and economic imbalances, unequal social services like healthcare and education. But the ultimate touchstone is legitimacy. What makes the China model legitimate? The answer can only be results. In just 40 years, China's GDP per capita has increased by about 50 times, lifting hundreds of millions out of poverty and making China the world's second largest economy, on track to become the largest. In almost every respect, Chinese quality of life has improved dramatically, including personal freedoms. Moreover, in every area of human endeavor, from economics and business to science and space exploration, China has become a much respected country. The great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, as President Xi Jinping has characterized the Chinese dream, gives great pride to the Chinese people. But China is not static. Chinese society is dynamic. And so to maintain its legitimacy, the China model must adapt, must change with the times. How so? Watching the China model keeps us closer to China.